go back to Hong Kong because in 2020, the Chinese Communist Party forced the government to pass the national security law, which basically effectively ended the 2019, let's call it the 2019 protests. What's happening in Hong Kong now, and is there any hope for them to build a new movement, or is it just like they lost, it's over, the Communist Party won, game over?
Well, this is very hard and difficult thing to predict. From my experience, wherever you have 60 or 70% of the population that support one vision of tomorrow, and you have 20 or 30% of the population that supports status quo or very different group of tomorrow, it's never game over. So it's like, just to take a look into what we are talking about here, it will very much depend on the capability of the movement to regroup, set up a new wave of goals, and post a new wave of challenges, as opposed to the calculation coming from Beijing, because this is where the real decision is made. I don't really see it made in a government of Hong Kong how to cope with this. And it's like, and unfortunately or fortunately, you can take a look at this as a game of the price tags. So if you have the opposition doing something, it's your estimate of whether or not where this price tag is acceptable for you, where the fact that you have 70% of the population of a very powerful economic hub that are demanding more freedoms, and you keep suppressing them, and you keep a kind of killing this very important economic hub economically in terms of the human resource, because if oppressed enough, they will leave. This is going to once again go back to the madurization of the situation. If young people in Hong Kong keep being oppressed, then all of these clever and educated people will leave. They'll go somewhere else.
But if you look at
are you ready to take this loss? That's the calculation for mainland China. Are you ready to witness the deterioration in this place because you want to maintain the firm power, or you're ready to do some concessions? This is, all of the nonviolent struggle is not imagining one big evil force on one hand that want to impose its evil will, and then, it's either game over or you win. It's not a zero-sum game. It is very often a game in which everybody takes the calculations. If you take a look at the way that China is tackling some other protests. So there's this thing called Protest Tracker, done by Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and it's really fun because it shows the ways the people protest. It just records protests and the reasons for protests. It's not going into the protest deeply, but it does a great thing. It shows you that despite what you see on the TV, majority of protests are not about human rights and democracy. Actually, very small proportion of protests is about human rights and democracy. Protests across the globe are growing around corruption, bread and butter issues. Recently, of course, handling the COVID. This is now the big peak, but this is a seasonal thing. It's like it's related to the pandemic, and a lot of this is environment. So take a look at how China handles huge number of protests around environment and coal plants and land grabs. It is not the Maduro thing. It is the accommodation thing. So you look at there is a huge number of protests annually happening across China, and a lot of this is about the corruption and the environment. They largely go widely undocumented because of the firewall, because of the censorship. The regime in Beijing is very effective in keeping this inside the pot, but they don't go with a kinetic force against the people who are protesting polluted air. They take a look at it and try to accommodate, and then eventually punish a few of their officials on the ground. This is most likely outcome of these scenarios. So if you take a look at how this entity is treating generally this kind of things, it seems that they have been, at least in the past, more likely to take a look at the kind of the accommodation scenario than full kinetic force, crackdown, welcome to Burma and have a nice day. So this is a very, very interesting dynamics. And once again, when you take a look at these things, you don't want to watch them black and white. They are very rarely black and white, and they are very rarely decided by one decisive battle. This is not the sprint, this is the marathon. And once again, perspectives from Hong Kong is they depend a lot on where a movement can regroup, but rest assured that the place where 70% of the people or 80% of the people believe in change, and with whatever type of repression you use on them, the people will either come back or they will leave. There is no way that 70% of the Hong Kongers will wake up tomorrow morning and say, "Oh, we love one-party system." We were in such a denial. Actually, it's great to have one-party system. We really love our local representatives being imposed from the outside. We were wrong. This is not going to happen.
Right. But it seems like, Beijing, the Communist Party no longer cares about Hong Kong's economy. It seems they've shown that, they're willing to, it's because Hong Kong is now only a small part of China's GDP because they've built up cities like, Beijing and Shanghai and Tianjin and many others, right? And so it looks like they're willing to let Hong Kong just kind of have the brain drain, lose a lot of companies. Beijing's willing to pay that price. So if that's the case, then what can people in Hong Kong do? Because they can no longer rely on that way to fight.
I don't know enough to make such an assumption. I really don't follow that closely things that are happening in China to say, oh, they give it up. I really don't know. So it's like the question is, if this is the case, then it's a really bad news. But it doesn't comply with everything else I know about the value that they put in the economy and about the value they put in. There's also this PR factor, If they let it die, they will look like losers, and they're very sensitive to be looking like losers. But once again, this is far beyond my like you need to speak to somebody who has a far more extensive foreign policy and diplomatic and economic knowledge about what's happening in Beijing. I'm looking into movements. I'm very far from even trying to be a geopolitical expert.
Well, so one thing you just kind of mentioned that I thought was very interesting was you can't have a movement based around sort of heady ideas like human rights and democracy. It has to be something more visceral. Like it makes me think of Milk, who, for years tried to promote homosexual rights, failed, but then he started talking about dog poop in San Francisco and got a lot of people on his side.
This makes all of the sense. First of all, once again, go back to the Movement 101 for Dummies. It's not you give up talking about democracy or climate change. Let's talk climate change. It's less slippery. So, okay, we have the climate change, and we all know that there is a climate change. And then we take a look at the map of the people who are there to be mobilized, and we are happy with the number of young people joining, educated people joining, people who read science joining, people who watch news joining. And then you figure out that the largest opponent of the climate change are coming from a rural, non-educated whatsoever. And it's a very similar breakdown in most of the population. So how do you bring farmers into your game of climate change? By telling them a story about Amazon woods, they don't know where the Amazon is. By telling them the story about, the concentration of CEO in the atmosphere, that's the language even I don't understand, and I have an MA in biology. By telling them the story about polar bears, they probably haven't seen the polar bear even in a zoo. So instead of that, you take a look at a place like Colorado, where I live, Iowa, where I've been last week, and take a look at how these people live. So you go to rural Colorado, you go to the place which grows cattle, which has farm, you sit down with a person who never left the 5,000 people town, votes regularly Republican, and it's 100% persuaded that climate change is a Chinese hoax or whatever QAnon sells to him. And you're asking, how is your life? And he says, recently, crap. Because of the draft, the Colorado is like most of the Midwest is going to the draft. We are losing a lot of cattle because we need all of these expensive irrigation systems that the small farms cannot afford. So the big players are coming, they're buying off the small farms. The families that lived here for generations had to leave or had to start working in Walmarts. They lose their houses, they feel miserable. Well, guess what? Connecting the drought with the climate change is the way to bring these people into the struggle without compromising the common goal, changing the world toward better when it comes to how we treat our planet. So finding what connects constituencies you need to mobilize. Sometimes it's a small thing like a dog's poop, and talking to people saying, we're gay or straight, I'm the person who will curtail you of the dog's poop. Sometimes talking about the drought and the cattle. Sometimes in Iowa talking about the corn and the herbicides. And like, this is how you turn people that you find traditionally opposed to your ideas being the part of your movement, because farmers care about their farms. And guess what? Farms are actually more sensitive to climate change than the high school kids. And when you take a look at this relationship and how you build it, this is how you build a coalition. This is how you build community. This is how you build onwards. And also comes with another soccer kind of a relationship. You win in soccer by controlling the middle field. You win in nonviolent movement by controlling the middle field. So that means you are the one who wants to be mainstream. And you are the one who wants your opponent to be extreme. And guess what? Authoritarians know that. Which is why they portray, LGBT people like luring kids into being gay. For example, they want to push you on a place where nobody wants to join you. Labeling movements as foreign mercenaries, terrorists, junkies. This is all the attempts of these regimes to keep the middle field and push you on the extreme. Taking a look into LGBT movement, it is the moment when they moved from extreme. We are queer and we are here. Take a look at us in our shiny little bathing suits on a gay pride. I'm not really much into looking, hairy butts in a swimming suits. I, however, very much support the equality of the people. And then they start understanding how the opponent pushed them on the radical place, in a very distant place. And they say, okay, all these conservatives, what they're talking about, it's a case in Serbia, very homophobic country still. Wherever you look at these right-wing nuts, they're talking about family values. So the moment the LGBT movement understand not only how to pick an issues like dog's poop and things that can relate to the people, but also adopt the language of their opponent and overtake this vision and move more into the mainstream. And the moment they start talking only about, whom they're sleeping with, which is actually a very private thing that, I don't go around and tell people that I sleep with women. This is not how I define my identity. Instead of that, the ingenuity of understanding that in order to win the middle field, you need to be the message. So now, instead of leaving this part of the battlefield to the conservatives, they say, okay, family values. We are all about family values. If I live with my loved one, with my beloved husband, in my case, for 10 years, and I die, how come that person cannot inherit my car or my apartment? If I live with my beloved husband in healthy community, we earn enough money, and we have a nice household, how come we cannot adopt the kids? And you can adopt the kids. We want to adopt the kids because we want family values. That's the moment of ingenuity of the LGBT movement when they start winning. And this is exactly how the movements cleverly overtake the middle ground. If I'm hit by the car, how come that it is not my husband who are the first one to visit me in the hospital? I'm all about family values. And now if you are trying to deny that right to me, only because we are two men or two women living in this household, that puts you on the extreme. And that puts me in the center of the family values. So this is how this game is played, by understanding that you need to win the middle ground, because this is where the numbers are. And when you take a look at the common spectator of this discussion, let's say one of you is listening to this discussion, say, yes, but it really makes sense. How come that man and woman can live in marriage for 10 years and immediately, one dies and, the other inherits whatever was the family property. And if two women live together for 10 years and in a loved relationship and one dies, the other one can't inherit. That doesn't make sense. So, it's like you understand how overtaking this thing is not only about picking the small things. That's more of a tactical thing. Very recommended, though. It's understanding where your opponent stands on this more of the visionary / value spectrum, and getting in the middle of this spectrum and overtaking the spectrum and making it your spectrum. And this is why LGBT movement will win and should win, because we should all be equal.